Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I deliver the body of my remarks, I do want to respond briefly to my colleague, the senator from Wyoming, on the question of national security, because just last night we learned that President Trump had fired the head of the National Security Agency right after his meeting with Laura Loomer, a right-wing activist. Not only was the head of NSA fired, but so were some other folks who worked at the National Security Council. You know, this is part of a pattern of President Trump firing people who have experience, people who know their subject matter, and replacing them with political cronies. We already saw the results of that sort of amateurism and amateur hour when it came to Signalgate, which is a big violation, of course, of classified information that very much well could have put our troops at risk. And so I think when we talk about national security, it's important to recognize what is happening in this administration that's undermining our national security. I want to focus, Mr. President, on the great betrayal. You know, when he was a candidate going all over the country, Donald Trump said that he was going to look out for the forgotten Americans, that he was going to focus on kitchen table issues. He was going to bring down prices. Day one, he was going to bring down prices. And yet, what we're witnessing right now is just the opposite. We're witnessing the rigging of the American government to gut services for working families. We all saw Elon Musk proudly brandishing a chainsaw not that many weeks ago at a CPAC conference in the state of Maryland. Well, they're cutting away at services that benefit every American family. And for what purpose? To help the billionaires. And the centerpiece of the great betrayal is arriving on the Senate floor today. That will be the kickoff for the next phase of that great betrayal, because Republicans are going to be taking the next step toward implementing a giant tax giveaway to the very, very wealthy, the already powerful, and big corporations. And they're going to pay in part for it at the expense of the rest of America, but they're also not going to pay for a big part of it, and that will come at the expense of the rest of America when you blow up the deficits and debt and put upward pressure on interest rates. Where they are talking about cutting are places like Medicaid, and we'll talk more about the very, very harmful impact that will have on the American people. The President's talking about offsetting the costs of the tax cuts for the very rich with revenues from tariffs, which amount to nothing more than a huge national sales tax. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then, of course, Elon Musk is claiming to find all these savings in the federal government. He's not making the government more efficient. He is actually rigging the government to help the very powerful, like trying to get rid of things like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which has returned billions of dollars to American consumers who were cheated by fraudsters. Some people don't like that. CFPB made some powerful enemies, and so they want to get rid of that. Just one example of how this is not about efficiency, but actually putting the government to work for billionaires and powerful people at the expense of the rest of the country. You know, Donald Trump has called this budget resolution that we're going to be debating on the floor as the first step to what is going to be the big, beautiful bill. Well, it is going to be a beautiful bill if you're a billionaire tech titan, or if you're a billionaire in the big oil industry or in big pharma. It's going to be great news for all of you, but for the rest of America, it will be the great betrayal. And Mr. President, we know this because we've seen this movie before, although this time we're going to see it on steroids. But back in 2017, during the first Trump tax cut for the wealthy, a lot of promises were made. And so we now have the reality of what happened to compare to the promises that were made at that time. So let's look at those promises. So Donald Trump promised that giving tax cuts to wealthy people and big corporations would generate so much additional economic activity by trickling down to everybody else and somehow lifting everybody up. He claimed that that would generate so much dynamic activity that it would generate additional revenue, and the additional revenue would be enough to offset the revenue lost because of tax cuts to rich people. Not even close to being true. In fact, what it did was added $2 trillion to the deficit. Just check with the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. And I've actually asked this question in repeated hearings in the Senate Budget Committee. I serve on that committee. And I ask it of Republican witnesses, Democratic witnesses, witnesses that are just called for their expertise. Not a single person has tried to claim that the tax cuts from 2017 actually paid for themselves. Not even close. So that didn't happen. We also heard the claim from Donald Trump back then that corporations that got these tax cuts would use some of their additional revenue to quickly boost wages by $4,000 on average to their workers, to their employees. That didn't happen either. What did happen was that some of those savings went to much bigger CEO bonuses. So that didn't happen for regular workers. It was really good for the CEOs. Another thing that Donald Trump and our Republican colleagues claimed back then was that when corporations got these big tax cuts, they would take those additional monies and invest them in plant and equipment, and therefore help the overall enterprise and grow it. That didn't happen either. What did the corporations use that extra savings for? Well, they used it for stock buybacks. So they used it to jack up the price for the stockholders, but they did not use it to help expand plant equipment that helped the overall economy. And by the way, about 30 to 40% of those stockholders are actually foreigners. They don't live in the United States. They're not Americans. So that big tax cut for the rich here, when it was used in the form of stock buybacks, was a great bonanza for a lot of very wealthy people overseas. So now we're back here on the eve of passing a Republican budget resolution. I hope we don't pass it, but it appears that Republicans have the votes. And we're seeing this movie all over again, deja vu. And it is worth, therefore, again, reminding us of what happened. Senator Wyden and I were on the floor the other day when he released a really blockbuster report about how major U.S. drug companies, big pharma, were able to exploit provisions of the 2017 Trump tax giveaway in a way that allowed them to dramatically lower their taxes. Pfizer's tax returns, we showed, had 50% of the revenues coming from U.S. sales, but only listed profits at the U.S. at zero, right? So Pfizer, when you look at their returns, they acknowledge that 50% of their revenues came from American customers, but they booked zero profit on those revenues and sales in the United States. And how did they do that? They did it by essentially using overseas tax havens. It's called round tripping. Essentially, they took profits here funneled them through these schemes overseas, and as a result, they lowered their taxes by 40%. And that's a pattern we've seen with other pharmaceutical companies as well. You know, other Americans don't have that ability, right? Those Americans who get their W-2 forms, you pay your taxes on those earnings. You don't get to funnel them through overseas tax havens. Mom and pop shops, small businesses, they can't make secret deals with foreign governments to hide their profits. So these schemes are designed to benefit one group and one group only, and that is very profitable corporations and very wealthy individuals. And the result is when Pfizer does the kind of schemes, employs the kind of schemes that it has, and they lower their effective tax rates, it means they're not paying their fair share here in the United States that we use to invest for the common good, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's our public schools, all things that, of course, Pfizer benefits from, just as other major corporations do. So it's just a form of freeloading on the rest of the American people. And that's what the Trump tax cuts for the wealthy are all about. Big handouts for the very wealthy, freeloading on the rest of Americans. And if you look at the folks who are cheering on Donald Trump at the swearing in at the inaugural, they were the folks that are going to be benefiting the most. Elon Musk was right behind him. Of course, Elon Musk spent $280 million to help elect Donald Trump. He's sort of getting more than his money's worth these days. Other billionaire tech titans, other billionaire members of the Trump cabinet, most billionaires by far of any cabinet in American history, those are the people who are going to benefit from the tax giveaway to the very wealthy. Everybody else is going to pay for it in one way or another. And I want to talk about some of the ways they're going to pay for it, the rest of America. One way is it's going to send our deficits and debts skyrocketing again. As I said earlier, back in 2017, they claimed that, it would all pay for itself. Well, it increased our deficits and debt by $2 trillion. This time, it's an even bigger whopping increase on the deficits and debt, $6 trillion over 10 years, and $37 trillion increase in the debt over the next 30 years. According to the Congressional Budget Office, these are the nonpartisan green eye shades guys, just the facts. That's the consequence of the Republican tax giveaway to the rich. Huge deficits in debt. As I said, 3 times higher than the last one, which was bad enough. And we're not incurring this additional debt because we're fighting a war. We're not incurring this debt to fight a pandemic or a recession. We're incurring all this additional debt just to give the big corporations and the wealthy another round of tax cuts. So maybe it's not surprising that we're already seeing an effort to hide what's happening. So how do you hide $6 trillion deficit and debt? Well, there are a lot of accounting gimmicks that are being employed. One of them is to say, well, let's just use the current policy baseline. Now, bear with me for a moment because this does get a little technical, but it is important and it also reveals the scheme that's being employed by Republican senators to try to cover up the costs of their tax cut for the very wealthy. You know, normally we use what's called a current law baseline. In other words, the Congressional Budget Office tells us how much the deficit and debt will increase by the policy changes we're making to current law. That makes sense because current law is what exists until we change it. So current law tells us what our deficits would be now under the framework we currently have. But Republicans want to change this to a current policy baseline. What they're saying is, well, they gave tax cuts to the very rich and corporations for 10 years, and now we're going to do it for at least another 10 years, so let's not count the additional costs of that when we compute the deficits and debt. Well, it doesn't really work that way in the real world. I mean, if you were let's take a wealthy person and you went through your family budget, and last year you bought 600 Rolexes, put a lot of strain on the budget, and then you're sitting around the kitchen table this year to draw up the budget for the upcoming year, and you say, well, you know, hi dear, you know, it really won't make our budget this year any worse if we buy another 600 Rolexes because we bought them last year. Now, that doesn't make any sense, and Americans know that. But that is exactly what Republican senators are trying to do with their budget gimmicks. They're going to try to pretend away $6 trillion in new debt. Now, if you look at the budget resolution, it does anticipate that kind of additional to the deficit and debt, but they say, well, we're also going to offset some of that by cutting $2 trillion. Now, when I do the math, if you claim you're cutting $2 trillion, and we'll talk a little bit about how they plan to do that, but you're increasing the deficit and debt by $6 trillion, even if you cut the $2 trillion, you're ending up with a whopping net deficit debt increase. That's going to drive up interest rates to every American and make it harder for all other Americans to pay for things like cars and houses, mortgages, interest payments on cars, and all this, again, in service of a tax cut for billionaires and big corporations. Now, what's another way that President Trump says he's going to pay for this tax cut to the rich and big corporations? Well, he says we're going to have all this additional revenue coming into the government through tariffs. He called it Liberation Day. We saw how the country responded. We saw how the markets responded. They went way, way down. Economists of all political stripes are predicting a much higher risk of recession. Some say it's much more likely than not at this point because of those tariffs. The president has unleashed a tariff war, and let's talk about what they are, because in effect, this is a national sales tax. This is pretty simple math. When you put a tax on goods coming in the United States, it is the importer, the American importer, that pays that. And if you have to pay that extra amount, and you have tight margins already, tight profit margins, you're going to have to pass that cost on to who? American consumers. That's why economists estimate that the Trump national sales tax is going to cost the average American household up to $4,200 a year. That's what the president is doing. That will come in many forms. The National Association of Home Builders predicts it will cost up to $10,000 more to build a home because we import lumber and gypsum from other countries. We have lumber and gypsum here in the United States, but in order to accommodate the demand for new homes, we also import it. And that will jack up the price, according to the National Association of Home Builders, up to $10,000. Others are predicting even more. A researcher at Cornell University estimates that new cars could cost as much as $20,000 more because of how many times certain car parts cross boundaries and will face tariffs. You may send a part to the United States. There's some business in the United States that works on enhancing that part. It goes back to another business overseas. They do something more. Then it comes back and is then used in an American car. If every time it crosses a border you're facing a big tariff, the cost of those cars are going to go up. In the case of the US-Canada border, sometimes auto parts cross them as many as 6 times before final assembly. So whether it's buying a car, buying a house, these are things families work hard to purchase, to save up for. The Trump tariffs are going to put them farther out of reach. This is a Trump tax increase on the American dream. And again, for what purpose? All to provide tax cuts and a big tax windfall to the very wealthy and the biggest corporations. But the harm from this national sales tax is not only the additional prices that Americans will pay here at home. It's also the losses to businesses in the United States that produce products here and export them overseas. Because the rest of the world's not going to stand still and do nothing while Donald Trump slaps a big tax on the products they're sending to the United States. They're not going to do that. In fact, China's already responded. They just imposed a 34% tariff on American products. They've also taken other measures to make it harder for American businesses that produce goods here and export them to China, make it harder for them to export those to China. But when China puts on a 34% tariff, and when other countries around the world respond, as they inevitably will, it means American companies here at home will not be able to sell as many of their goods around the world. That's pretty obvious. Again, that's pretty simple math. That means they'll have to lay off people. That means less economic activity here at home. And again, all for what purpose? To say you're offsetting tax cuts for the very wealthy. And if anybody doubts that this does not cost American producers and manufacturers, let's just look back to the first Trump administration, where there was a mini version of this tariff war, a much smaller one. And even that smaller one cost the American taxpayers dearly. Because what happened was, when President Trump in his first term, when he imposed tariffs on Chinese products coming to the United States, China responded. They slapped on tariffs to American exports, especially American agricultural exports. Wheat, soybeans. What did that mean? Again, in simple math, it meant that those American producers sold less goods in China, and it cost them. And what did President Trump do then? He actually used a big taxpayer subsidy. It was around $28 billion to pay off American farmers who had been hurt by his mini trade war at that time. Well, Mr. President, the best way not to hurt American farmers is not to slap on these tariffs in the first place, which inevitably invite retaliation. And why should the American taxpayer have to foot the bill for all this? Last time this was a mini trade war. Now he's taken this worldwide. Imagine if you had to cover the costs for losses of every American business through some taxpayer subsidy. I mean, it would be just a huge number. So here we have the President of the United States wreaking havoc on the American economy, and again, to pay for tax cuts for the very rich. You know, I had some very small businesses in my state of Maryland write into me about some of these costs that they're facing. Here's one I got just a couple weeks ago, and this is from, again, a very small business in Greenbelt, Maryland. It says, in 2 weeks, this is a person who has a small hand-dyed cotton yarn business. And she writes, most of my yarns are imported and can't easily be replicated by domestic suppliers. In 2 weeks, I will receive my first custom blend yarn from Peru, which has taken me and the mill the better part of a year to develop. The 10% tariff on Peru, imposed with no warning and no provocation, means this yarn will suddenly cost me about a mortgage payment extra. Several of my existing yarns will also cost 10 to 25% more now when I go to reorder, thanks to the tariffs on Canadian and EU tariffs. This cuts severely into my already tight margins. Again, this woman is talking about cutting losses, cutting her income and missing a mortgage payment. This is a very small business. Here's another letter. My daughter and I own a greeting card and paper packaging distribution company. It's our 45th year in business. We employ some 20 Baltimore City and county residents and have 100 plus independent sales reps throughout the United States selling our product. While most of our products are manufactured in the UK and the European Union, 20 to 25% of our product, which is designed in the UK, is manufactured in China. And because of the first Trump administration, the costs of that went way up. But now with this new round, it brings the total sales tax cost, the tariff on this small business, to 45% with 10% increases each month. This person says they have, I think, 20 people, 50 people. They're gonna lay off about 10% of their employees if this happens, and it just did happen. So this imposes real harm and costs on the American people. As I say, it's a double whammy. First, it's a national sales tax, and so American consumers pay more, and then American businesses get socked because they can no longer export as many of their goods and products overseas. So let's look at another way that Senate Republicans want to pay for this tax cut for the very rich and the big corporations. And that's by cutting Medicaid. Now, all you have to do, Mr. President, is look at the instructions in the House budget resolution, which will be part of what is considered here today. And as the Congressional Budget Office has told all of us, the only way to find the $880 billion that they want to cut under the jurisdiction of the House Energy and Commerce Committee is to come after Medicaid. I mean, it's just mathematically impossible to do it otherwise. And so while Donald Trump said he, quote, loves and cherishes, unquote, Medicaid, that's not what they're actually doing. And in addition to taking direct hits at Medicaid, and we've discussed the impact of that on the floor of this Senate at length, and we will discuss them at greater length, we also see Elon Musk and Donald Trump going after the people who administer Medicaid and Medicare benefits. In fact, just last week, they fired at least 300 civil servants at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS. They provide and deliver those health care benefits to 160 million Americans across our country. I want to read just one message from one of those fired civil servants. I just got this letter on Monday, Mr. President. Quote, today my life was changed so swiftly, I can barely catch my breath to consider what I have now lost. Just wanted to share my story after 44 years of public service, 30 in the military, and 14 in the federal government, I was proudly serving the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, and I got a letter today ending my public service. Cold, hard. It said, and she quoted, "Thanks for your service. We basically don't need you anymore." And this is to a disabled veteran who loves her country and has been serving, as she writes, since I was 18 years old. And I have raised my right hand more times than I can remember. I want my story out there to help others. Federal workers and especially veterans don't deserve this treatment. No one does. And that is a story we're hearing across the federal government. People fired indiscriminately, based on a big lie. Many of these people, just to add insult to injury, got letters saying they were being fired for poor performance, only to find out that they'd actually received glowing performance reviews, and in many cases had been recently promoted based on their merit. And that's not only happening at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid, and again, these are the people who help deliver those benefits. You know, benefits don't do much for you if the people who deliver them and administer them are gone. And of course, that's what's happening at the Social Security Administration as well. Social Security Administration, they came in, they randomly, indiscriminately fired a lot of people, and now reports indicate that they want to get rid of over 8,000 more folks at the Social Security Administration. These are the folks who deliver Social Security benefits to 73 million Americans, 1 in 6 Marylanders. And Social Security keeps 20 million Americans, including kids, out of poverty. In fact, that's how many people, we have 73 million people on Social Security. For 20 million of them, that is the difference between being in poverty or not being in poverty. And I should point out, Mr. President, this is not about government efficiency, as I said earlier. If you look at the 12,000 federal employees who work at the Social Security Administration, which is in Baltimore, we're proud that they have their home there. They've been running the Social Security Administration for the past 90 years and have never missed a payment. So when Secretary of Commerce Lutnick said, you know, I don't think Americans would miss 1 week of their Social Security payments. Only the fraudsters would feel that. They're the only people who would notice. What a pile of garbage. He said his mother wouldn't notice. Well, you know, how many sons and daughters how many moms and dads have billionaire sons? That's the question. I'll tell you, 73 million Americans will notice, Mr. President. But that's the kind of attitude, the attitude we're seeing from Elon Musk, the richest person in the world, and Donald Trump. I see my colleagues are on the floor here, and so I'm going to wrap up my remarks. But I will be speaking more in coming days, and I see both my colleague, the ranking member of the Finance Committee, and Senator Klobuchar from Minnesota. And I'll tell you this, Mr. President. The proposal we're going to hear from the Republicans is to add $6 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years to pay for tax cuts for the rich. You know, if you really want to blow through the deficit like that, there are a lot of other more important things we could do for the country with that money. We could save Social Security. Think about that. We could fund special education fully in our schools and finally meet those promises. We could expand Medicare to give seniors dental, vision, and hearing benefits, something that Senator Sanders from Vermont has been calling for a long time. We could expand the child tax credit. If you want to blow through the deficit and debt by $6 trillion or $37 trillion over 30 years, we have a lot better uses for that money than tax cuts for rich people and big corporations. And I yield the floor.